So, Neil, you were just telling me how the state of the world's driving you to drink.
Well,
That you're hungover because it's driven you to drink, and you were on the lash last night, as I say, and you don't think you'll be able to get your thoughts together well enough today because the state of the world, and it's the state of the world's fault, right?
yeah, absolutely.
No,
It's-
actually,
it's,
you were.
it's social collapse.
Yeah,
It's a condition that causes you to just reach out for the
nearest bottle of liquor.
yeah,
Yeah,
preferably a good one.
ideally, yeah, but anything will do, like in a
Yeah.
pinch, you know.
Thanks, Joe, for outing me there.
Yeah, well, we're all about truth and honesty in this show, you know. So, you were telling me about Alex Jones claims that he uses a bottle to cope with.
Yeah, yeah. He said it. He said as much during a rambling. I mean, he was drinking at the time on his more recent podcast with Joe Rogan. I think it was the second one where him, Joe Rogan, and Matt Dillon, Tim Dillon,
Yeah,
New York comedian, were there. I mean, he was drinking during the show, but he said, yeah, he drinks a lot, you know, and he drinks like that he would drink in a similar way that others use coffee to simulate. Like he'd be falling asleep, trying to get his head around 50 different articles, news items he wants to condense into the next news segment or article or something. And the only way he can power through it is with the help of hard liquor. You know, I feel for him a bit because he's probably a prisoner of his own. He said also I'm getting that idea from him. He said, I'm kind of like a slave to this. I've been doing it for so long, just so much content, and he's driven, and yet he's kind of trapped in it. The only way he can do it is to drink,
yeah,
and probably also the only way he can cope with it emotionally. Although he's not exactly one to talk about his emotions. I'm surmising that.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the state of the world is, I mean, if people, focus on it too much and dig into it and stuff and try and figure it out, it can be pretty stressful, especially because it all points to there not really being any kind of solution, All of the arrows are pointing towards this is going down the toilet at some point in the not too distant future, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. There's just, there's no recourse to anybody or any power or anything to kind of talk about a sense and
or any revolutionary or creative mass solution.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't seem to be
that's
available.
That's harsh, I know, because that immediately takes a big swing at what motivates a lot of them. I mean, on the left, Russell Brand, that's what he's all about. That we can, if we just hit critical mass and allow the solutions to come up and share them and communicate them with each other, another world is possible. It's the same basic slogan of the left.
Yeah.
But it's also the right that's fueled by that too. I mean,
in their own way.
What motivates Tim Pool, Paul Joseph Watson, Alex Jones, the whole spectrum to get up and do what they do hyperactively day after day? They really want to fix the problems. They think they can be done, and they're prepared to do it, to grind themselves into poor health, poor mental health, poor physical health, to do it. Bless them. But we think they're misguided because, well, we've taken
a philosophical
starting point that this is way bigger than any movement or set of ideas can fix. Set of human ideas, let's say, there are.
It's not about fixing it, basically, is our perspective that the world isn't for anybody to fix. It's there to be experienced, essentially, and to be learned from, and there's an awful lot to learn from what's going on in the world today. But you have to pay attention to it, because there's a lot of people out there who aren't learning anything from it in terms of how things actually work and why things work the way they work and stuff, So it's like observing a giant organism, and and as it changes and grows and that kind of stuff, and an organism made up of 8 billion people, all with individual personalities and stuff. So it's very interesting, and if you can take that perspective of a kind of like an anthropological perspective in a certain sense, as if you're studying or observing a species that was going through a certain stage of its kind of life cycle, let's say, or something like that you hadn't seen before, something like that. It gives you a certain distance from it. But if you get too close to it and think that this is me, basically. This is my future. This is my life. This is the life of my children, or the future of my children. Then
look at me now, Ma. I'm an influencer.
Yeah, well, not only that,
because you start to actually believe that you're having an influence.
That, but also wanting to change
aren't.
it. Yeah. Wanting to change it is and believing that you're part of it, that you're in the middle of it, that all the chaos happening is spelling impending doom for you and your family and the people you love. Then you can get very stressed about it.
Of course, and to alleviate that,
well, you try.
You get involved.
You get harder and harder, further and further into it, and more involved in it, and to shout louder and louder and stuff, But then it's kind of pissing against the wind, as I say, because doesn't seem to be a solution in that direction, and there doesn't seem to be a solution as people perceive it. It's quite clear that that there are people on this planet with very different perspectives and very different natures, or views of the world, which are a function of their being, of their essence, let's say, of who they are at a very fundamental level, and never the twain shall meet between those two types of people. So all you're going to do is just increase the polarity and increase the conflict and the tension between those two. That's not going to help. So the only sane for people to really have been looking at closely, and certainly looking at over history, is a very important part of getting a perspective on where we are today. You have to look at where we came from, and the only really sensible, rational and sane perspective to take on it is a kind of more detached one, because anything else, like the idea of getting involved in it and working for change and stuff, clearly it's being people who do that are pushed back against left, right and centre. There doesn't seem to be a way out in that path.
They're directed blindly, unintentionally, into agitating for something they don't see at the time, but looking back 3 years later, they're like, okay, so that whole spiel was another red herring, and I was banging on about it at the time, churning out lots of content, and all I was effectively doing, if they were honestly thinking about it and looking back, was agitating a mass of people for some other purpose I didn't understand.
They being governments, whoever, authorities, agitating people, getting people worked up and focused on some particular enemy. Seems to be the case if you look at it. I mean, in recent years anyway, there's been multiple enemies presented to the global population, and particularly Western populations, but the global population increasingly so, as something to focus on and something to work for and agitate. We all have to get together. We're all in this together. We all have to do something. Let's put our energies into combating this threat. I mean, there's been global, that on a global scale, obviously with COVID, we're all in this together. We have to do our part. We have to play our part. We have to be responsible, and we can get through this. And obviously with climate change and global warming, we can all do our part to save everyone's lives and save the planet. I mean, it doesn't get much bigger than that. The planet from this threat.
Too big.
Specifically in the US, a few years ago, you had, obviously, or for quite a long time, you had Russia primarily as the threat in the US and in Western countries. Russia was a threat that people could focus on. So there's all of these kind of like chunks of meat being thrown to the population in order for them to chew on effectively and to...
An old one that has a current expression too is communism. Now it's China. If we just rout out the Chinese influence in our myths,
it's almost like a catharsis for people. They feel that something's wrong with the world. They should be fighting back against something that is evil or wrong.
The
or
dark
bad.
forces.
Dark forces, and then so you put a face in those dark forces, and you can give them. People in particular, governments in different countries can give a face to those dark forces that suits the government, right? That is in line with the government's own personal objective. Like in the case of America, they put a Russian face on it because it serves the power brokers in the US to have the population join them in their focus on demonizing Russia, for example, or China. But then more generally, you have, like I said, COVID, the invisible, mini microscopic nanoparticle-sized terrorist threat. That's hiding under your bed and everywhere else.
And the all-encompassing threat from everywhere, above, below, inside, everywhere. Climate change.
Climate change, exactly. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. And that's what we mean by kind of looking at that from that kind of perspective, studying the whole thing. And it requires a level of detachment, but that level of detachment is very useful in terms of reducing your stress levels about the whole thing. Because if you're not right in the middle of it, you don't feel like your future, your life, or the life of your family depends on you sorting this out, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, enough philosophizing. What are we talking about? COVID, but we're talking about COVID. Let's jump straight into COVID. There's been another step. It's not really a big deal. There's not really much to say on the COVID. Well, there's a few things to say on the COVID front, but it's stuff that it's just updates on what we've said before. The next kind of next level, or next part of the stick that has been brought out to beat people with has been produced by the Austrian government.
Oh God, yeah.
Which that's all it is. The Austrian government has said that they are going to. Do you have that? Did I send it to you, Scott? A Sputnik article? Yeah. Austria becomes the world's first country to impose COVID-19 lockdown on unvaccinated. The Austrian High Chancellor, Alexander Schallenberg, announced on Sunday that national lockdown starting next week for those who did not get the shot against COVID-19. Unvaccinated will be able to leave their homes only for several basic needs, such as going to work, doing groceries, or visiting a doctor. The decision to impose this measure was made upon the conference involving the government and heads of federal states of Austria. The restrictions will enter into force early Monday, that's tomorrow, Schallenberg told a press conference, but children under 12 will be exempt. He highlighted that police will monitor compliance with these restrictive measures and offenders will face punishment. And then, the most important part, on the same day as these measures come in, tomorrow a national revaccination campaign will begin. So that tells you all you need to know about that. That's pretty much just the same stick they've been using. We're threatening people with the removal of their civil liberties if you don't get the vaccine.
If I can add to that from The Guardian, they report that separately, the German government said it planned to tighten restrictions against unvaccinated people.
Lockstep.
So the High Chancellor of Germany would like to follow suit. They're going to watch Austria and see.
Well, yeah. Well, at one point they were kind of united, Austria and Germany, under a certain type of regime, no?
Anschluss.
Yeah. Not so long ago. So, I mean, it's just going back to...
Old times.
Back to the good old days. Back to the good old days of carting people off to places for not doing what they're told, for not taking medical procedures.
But it's carting people off. It's
They're
more
not
bluff.
It's a joke. It's a joke.
joke.
If I was in Austria now,
I've read that they're going to have random spot checks,
Yeah.
checkpoints. Wow.
If I was in Austria right now, I'd be laughing. I'd be like,
Yeah, good
whatever.
luck.
You know what? I'm not getting vaccinated. I don't care. Because it's a paper tiger. There's nothing to this. It's a joke. They're just trying to threaten me with the removal of civil liberties that, you know, they won't really remove or won't really impact me, so I'm not going to bother worrying about it. And I'm certainly not going to go and rush and get the vaccine because as a result of this kind of manipulation or coercion.
There might be an internal strategic motive to this because they're specifically targeting two regions in Austria, one around Salzburg and also Upper Austria. So they probably notice which parts contain pockets of resistance, let's say, and then, try to increase specific local pressure.
Yeah.
They've said, although we've heard that the president is directing this, the president in Austria is really a figurehead. He deals more with
The
foreign
chancellor,
policy.
yeah.
The chancellor. I think. Isn't that the case? Isn't the prime minister? Oh, no, hang on. I'm getting confused. There is a president of Austria. The chancellor is the elected PM. Okay. But similarly to what we're seeing in Russia, where Putin is trying to, take a backseat and say, well, the federal government isn't pushing any of this. We're allowing the regions to decide what they want to do.
Yeah. Well, although that's the federal government mandating it for certain regions in Austria. You know what I mean? It's the chancellor who made this decision, right?
Okay,
so
it is from the top.
Enforced by the government. But don't you find it interesting, though, that obviously there's a bunch of people significant enough number of people in Austria who haven't got vaccinated, and they have their reasons for it, but no one's asking them. They're wrong, and the government tells you what's right. And you're talking about people's health. You know, they can spin it into protecting others. That's the only way they could spin it in terms of it being justified to coerce people to get a medical treatment. Would be that if you don't get this medical treatment, you're a danger to others. Otherwise, there's no justification for it. Those people, I mean, it takes away the whole idea of bodily integrity in you as an adult human being being able to make a decision for your own health and to say, you know, take advice from whoever you want and then say yes or no to that advice. But you're not allowed to do that anymore. And they're more than flirting with this idea of physically restraining people, you know, imprisoning people if they don't, or in some way punishing people if they don't take a medical procedure on the basis of course, the background narrative is that if you don't do it, you're endangering other people. But as you were saying earlier on, and there's lots of data right now, and have been a lot of data of late, that people who are vaccinated are the ones who are showing up in hospitals with COVID. Do you have that?
Yeah. This is for the UK. It's the latest
Right.
it's the latest data from Public Health England, which we and many others have referenced.
But this is going on around around the world, you know, in places that have high levels of vaccination, where there people who are vaccinated are turning up at emergency rooms and in hospitals.
While Scotty opens that link, I'll just also mention the Guardian article on Austria's lockdown. They sidestep the whole issue of individual rights, bodily autonomy, by just simply having a central paragraph that says about 65% of Austria's population are fully vaccinated. So is that too low? You know, the European average, they say, is about 67%. So it's not way off. I mean, but then they just have a simple statement with no backup. They just say, experts say a vaccination rate of at least 75% is needed to control the pandemic. Next sentence.
Right.
Moving on. So they insert that. Well, that's our appeal. It's an appeal to, you know, the people as a whole. What's needed? Bodily autonomy, that's, you know, individual rights. Listen, we have a war against the virus to fight here.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is justified by that then. Oh, yeah, okay. So this is the latest data from Public Health England. 83% of COVID-19 deaths and 67% of hospitalizations, presumably with COVID-19, were among the fully vaccinated during the past month in England.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen similar stats all year, but I think that ratio is increasing from earlier stats. And their table there is from Public Health England. 83% of COVID-19 deaths are among the fully vaccinated. And 2/3 in the hospitals. Remember what they're saying now? Oh no, we never created these vaccines to prevent transmission and to prevent you from getting sick.
Mm-hmm.
We did it to prevent, they say now, hospitalizations and deaths.
Right.
But they're showing up in the numbers, in much greater numbers than the non-vaccinated. How do they spin that?
Well, they don't, do they? Really? I mean, it's not being spun. Really, it's just it doesn't really make any sense, and they're not commenting on it. Basically, is the idea. They don't really follow through the logic of what that means. You know, that vaccines don't work. I mean, it's a gift, like we've said before. It's a gift that keeps on giving. Obviously, vaccines are down to, in some cases, down to like 3% after 6 months, 3% efficacy, i.e., they don't no longer work after 5-6 months. They're basically useless, which is why they're talking about boosters now. So, for all the people who have gotten the vaccine, a lot of them are, I don't know how many, but certainly the older people who are most terrified by government messaging over the past 18 months, they're going in droves to get their third shot, their booster, and probably, you know, they'll be extending that out to under 65s in the near future, in order to quote unquote save Christmas,
and to quote unquote travel,
and to be a free citizen. So those people just have bought in, and they'll keep they'll keep buying now at this point, I suppose. I don't know how long it'll go on if people will just accept that they have to get a booster or a vaccine for COVID twice a year or whatever. But so in that respect, talking about the pandemic and keeping it going and blaming it on the unvaccinated, or vaguely blaming it on the unvaccinated, but not really, because the data shows that it's the. But it seems that what they're not actually saying is that at this point, well, although some people have said it explicitly, but the obvious conclusion is that, like I just said, the vaccines don't last very long. So, and this virus isn't going away. I've heard that term repeatedly from authorities. It's not going. We're going to have to live with it, but living with it, it seems, is you get regular vaccinations for it. If they would just kind of like relax and say, okay, all the people who are going to get vaccinated have got vaccinated, that's a good enough number. It's 65, 70, in some places 80% of the population have taken the vaccination. So we are now assured a regular income. Pharmaceutical companies are assured a regular income for the next, well, forever, potentially, from 70, 80% of the population who will come twice a year to get vaccinated against this. And we're just going to have to live with it, right? Why can't they just drop the whole thing and just, in that sense,
Yeah.
They've got what they wanted, basically, which is a significant percent of the population, a significant majority of the population vaccinated. So why not just leave it at that? Are they really going to turn the screw and want to get the last few drops out of that other 20%, 10, 20% of the population? I don't know. It seems a bit...
Well, I was speaking rhetorically, but maybe there's more to it than that. But when they look at where demographically in their own country, any given government, or where geographically the rates aren't quite what we'd like, whatever standard that they're setting it against, they might see it as there's a problem here. There's a lack of informed citizenry or
obedience.
Well, they will never. Maybe will they consciously connect that in their minds?
Probably.
They might look at it and go, "Oh, there's a lot of ignorance in these parts.
Yeah,
we need to get out there and to help them, save them."
There's been so much official, from official sources and from the media, admission that government messaging on this has been so convoluted, so confusing, that you can't really blame people for not really, certainly you can't blame them for thinking twice about it or not being completely convinced by government messaging on it. And certainly, as we've said many times, the evidence before most people's eyes is that this really hasn't been anything approaching what most people would have thought a deadly pandemic was prior to 2020. If you just throw up that link, it's from a really good Twitter account. Neil, you should probably subscribe to it if you have a look out there. It's from anyway. It's
I follow that account.
Yeah.
FYI.
Yeah. It's this is actually something that came out just during the week there in France. It's just a translation of it. They're translated. Its translation is the Technical Agency for Information on Hospitalizations in France. It's an official organization that every year puts out a report on the activity in hospitals, what was going on in hospitals in the past year. And they put out a report for 2020 just this week in France, for hospitals in France, and what was going on. And it states in part that, as you can see there, COVID patients represented 2% of all hospitalized patients during 2020 across all hospitals. So 2%. Do you remember, does that sound like what you remember, what was going on in hospitals last year in France or in any other country? Because these numbers are similar in most other countries. 2% of hospitalizations.
I'm not sure how to answer that because I have two versions in my head. One is the media version where they were crammed full of dead and dying COVID patients.
Yeah.
The other version is the one where the alternate sort of ears on the ground version was which hospitals were empty.
Hospitals are empty. Well, it sounds like this data, that second one's being backed up by this data from an official source. And this was talked about on major French mainstream news, politics, chat shows. If you just go back to the tweet there, Scotty. So 2% in all 2% of all hospitalizations. Then scroll down. COVID patients represented 5% of all patients managed in ICU or critical care units. So in ICU, intensive care, 5%. The other 95%, something else. 8% of hospitalization days within these critical care units were dedicated to the management of COVID. That's hospital days, 8%. So very small percentages. And COVID was interesting. It was responsible for 2% of hospital admissions among those over 80 years old. Remember, it was the most deadly to the older you are, the more deadly it is. 2% of over 80s were hospitalized last year with COVID. Or rather, 2% of over 80s who were hospitalized for COVID. It was 2% represented COVID. And 1/3 of that 2% died of COVID, which is 0.6% of all over 80-year-olds.
Who ended up in hospital.
Yeah.
Not of all 80-year-olds.
No, 0.6%. Yeah. Well, it's 2% of all over 80-year-olds, I think. No, 2%. Yeah, 2% of hospital admissions among those over 80 years. Okay, yeah, so it's 0.6% of that 2%.
Yeah.
And in contrast, they make the point that each year in France, heart failure kills 15% of those over 80 years old.
Who require hospitalization?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
The same number, basically. Of all over 80s who go into hospital every year and die as a result, or die from what they went into hospital for, 15% of them are killed by cardiac problems. Last year, 0.6% were killed by COVID, and 2% of those hospitalizations were for COVID. This is, and here, just down below there, I put it, it's in French, though, but it's one example of several mainstream media shows that debated it, and the guy's on there and he's just reading all this out, and the people in the studio, because there's other guests there, they're just looking at it going...
Were they shocked or just...
They're just kind of like blank. They're like...
Did they just go, anyway,
And the host then says, well, okay, so it seems like it was maybe overhyped a little bit. It was what we were told wasn't really reflective of what was going on. Okay. And moving on. So... There you go. I mean, but that's what we're dealing with in the world today in general. It's a small example of, across many different fields, of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, factual reality versus
what people believe is actually happening. And they don't care. Once they believe that something is the way it is, no amount of evidence, it seems, hard, irrefutable evidence, will sway them from that belief.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult to sway people. And that's part of the human condition, right? So...
well, that
people.
reminds me of those polls. I think they were done in the UK, where people were asked how many, as a percentage of the overall population, how many do you think of us died last year?
Right.
And people had something like, there was a multiple choice. I think they could give all kinds of really sky high figures, but they're reasonable people, so they settled for one of the middle numbers, which is like 8%. Yeah. So something like 4 or 5 million Brits, of the surviving Brits of the pandemic, thought that 4 or 5 million of their compatriots
were dead,
were lost to the pandemic.
Yeah. But sure, people have no idea. And this is one thing I was kind of shocked to realize that, when I tell people back home, like my parents and stuff like that, when I tell them about the number of people who, because they're hearing all these numbers all last year, but people who are dying every day, and then I tell them the number of people who die every month in that country, and they're just like, wow, I didn't know that. They had no idea. People have no idea how many people die around them all the time. And last year they were given a blow-by-blow account of every single death almost by the media, and they were obviously shocked because they had no reference for it. And most people still don't have a reference for it. So,
well, and they're still being bombarded with fresh BS and news.
Yeah.
Like the World Health Organization warns that Europe as a whole is once again going to be the center of the pandemic.
Right.
Next year, the WHO forecast this week that there will be 500,000 more deaths in Europe by February.
Another dodgy model.
Just dodgy model, random number, 500,000, throw it out there.
Yeah. A nice round number, 500,000.
It's a nice round number, and it's probably based on something like how many people die all the time in a population of, what is your population? 500 million?
Yeah. 500,000 is like, is it 1%? No, 0.1%. Whatever.
Of Europe's population,
yeah. Anyway, we talked about this last week, I think, just a little bit. There was just a good video someone put together. We put up some articles last week on sports people, and there's a lot of talk now about, I mean, again, this is something that happened a while ago, because the vaccine rollout has rolled out to everybody who is going to be rolled out to anyway at this point, and the negative effects, any negative effects from the vaccine have been seen over the past several months through the summer and stuff, because people started getting the vaccine around maybe March, April, younger people and stuff. And certainly for young people, particularly young people, teenagers in their 20s, athletes, that kind of thing, they would have been maybe a bit more hesitant, so they maybe left it a bit later. So certainly over the summer and towards the end of the summer, you had a lot of, that's when we're going to see a lot of, if there were going to be any, we're going to see a lot of the negative effects from it. It's Wittgenstein on Twitter, Scotty. Just a little video. A compilation video.
Coroner says the condition is rare. It's just one of those tragedies.
Did she have any signs before this race?
Absolutely not. She felt like she was in the best shape of her life.
That's incredible.
Boom, 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 boom. There's a lot.
That's the Barcelona player.
USC wants to attack, but you've got to be careful. He collapsed.
We have a player down.
Yeah.
Something happened to one of the referees.
If you want to jump to...
We've had a heartbreaking situation here.
If you want to just jump to the next tweet, Robert Malone, up above, yeah, at the top. Keep going up. Yeah. That's the same one, is it?
Looks like it, yeah.
It is.
627. I don't know. I have a different video on that. 627 at the end of it. 706, 506, 7.
High school senior is in the hospital after collapsing on the tennis courts.
Breaking new details on the deaths of a high school soccer player.
Finland, Denmark star man Christian Eriksen collapsing towards the end of the first half.
The Kennedy High community mourning tonight after one of their high school football players died.
A South Carolina high school football player has died after collapsing at football practice.
Star college basketball player collapsing on the court. We want to warn you, the video may be difficult to watch.
Florida Gators star Keontae Johnson collapsing during the game.
A West Catholic high school student has died after collapsing during a football scrimmage.
On mile 8, she suddenly felt fuzzy and blacked out.
17-year-old Ryan Jacobs' heart stopped.
Unexpectedly collapsed on the field.
Megan went into cardiac arrest.
Collapsing during Friday night's football game.
The reason for his collapse is unknown.
The reason why Manny collapsed in the first place still isn't known.
So you might be wondering how someone in such great shape could suffer cardiac arrest.
It's a rare thing that happens.
The coroner said.
Yeah, so that's all. If you see the dates and all those, you can slow them down. You can see the dates are all basically April to September this year, you know, with a lot of them in the later summer. And sure, it happens on a game where athletes will kind of have heart problems or any different kind of problems while playing, you know, but it's relatively rare. And I don't think anybody can disagree that over the past 6 months, the number of them over the past 6 months are way beyond the normal. And obviously, someone who's interested in science and on a scientific mind would say, okay, this is something we need to look at and try and figure out what the cause is here, you know, or what the correlation at least is, you know, and it wouldn't be too hard to figure it out, right? There's not much of any significance that has been different this year in terms of the life of an athlete than the vaccination campaign with an experimental vaccine, an mRNA vaccine.
Yeah.
Which, according to the CDC, is known to cause heart inflammation in very rare cases. And of course, people who would, you know, respond to this, who wouldn't be of like mind with us, let's say, would say that, well, you know, that's to be expected. You know, how many athletes are there in America or in the West, and how many of these people had these effects? You know, but again, I'm sure you can say it's a tiny percentage. It is very rare and stuff, but it's not rare from the point of view of the safety standard that was applied to vaccines before this one.
That's what's changed.
The safety standards have been dropped super low
for
this vaccine.
Yeah.
And is that not a problem? Well, then you can say, well, I might have died of COVID. It's better. It's better.
They don't deny it. They acknowledge that it's going on. And if they're not saying something absurd like, well, it's normal, or it's okay, it's myocarditis, most teens will, you know, survive it. True, they'll survive it, but they'll be forever weakened. They can kiss goodbye to a professional career. If they're not saying that, then they're coming back to aggregates. Don't get down into they flee from individual autonomy, bodily rights, because they go back to the aggregate and they say, yeah, but hold on a second, we're dealing with a pandemic. Hundreds of millions of people were vaccinated. Of course, there's going to be casualties. Mm-hmm. We said as much at the start, you know. So,
yeah,
everything is justified because of how they massively overinflated the danger from COVID-19.
Was there somebody got a problem in the comments there? Pablo Popova.
Yeah, he says, where did it go?
Further up.
What a crap. WLT was about Poland-Belarus border or WHTF.
Dude, just relax. You know, we're going to get there, but, you know, it's not the only news that happened this week. You know, I know Poland is the center of your world and stuff because you live there, but
I saw an earlier comment from him. He says his brother is at the front. So there
doing what?
As a soldier.
Right.
So there are several thousand troops up there. It's pretty tetchy.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a little minute. We just want to finish up with this COVID business because, you know, and knock-on effects in the COVID business, which are, for example, we talked about in previous shows, supply chain problems. They're continuing. CNN, in particular of note, has said supply chain issues, they're going to go away. It's all fine. But then you just do a search today for supply chain problems on Google, and you see plenty of reports saying that it hasn't gone away from today and yesterday. There's one there from MSN, Scotty, if you want to stick it up. Supply chain problems affect discount stores like TJ Maxx and Marshalls. This is just one of many. You can look, there's plenty of different articles showing that supply chain businesses are experiencing problems with supply chain. With the supply chain, you won't be able to get designer clothes from TJ Maxx. Yeah, first world problem, but whatever. It's maybe a sign of worse things to come. And then if we just the next one on MSNBC, a bastion of ideological bullshit for the most part. There's a video here on these supply chain issues just from past day or two. You just play it there, and you'll see what the story is.
Complex reason for the country's backlog supply chain is something surprisingly simple. There just aren't enough people to drive the trucks. Now, the industry, which predominantly employs white men over the age of 55, has a massive retention problem with a 92% turnover rate last year, leaving a shortage of 80,000 truck drivers nationwide. And guess who's needed to bail out the industry? Our next guest will tell us. Joining me now, Pamela Day, owner and president of the Cross Country Truck Driving School. Pamela, so happy to have you here. I have to tell you, my brother is a truck driver, and he drives across the country, and it's very nerve-wracking to me when he's on the road because it feels like a dangerous industry. But you're trying to disrupt that and bring more people who look like us to the industry. Tell us why.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, thank you for having me this morning. And yes, we are. And we say we're not building truck drivers, but safe CMV operators, folks that can get back to their home whenever they're done with their shift. That's the most important part, ma'am.
Well, how can the industry be more welcoming? Because I have to tell you, I talked to a lot of truck drivers and preparing for this segment, and most of these truck drivers are people of color, and they talked about, hearing some of the racism over the CB. This is, again, an industry populated by a lot of white men over the age of 55. This group of people overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Some people have talked about, aggressive truck drivers, cutting them off or not being helpful. So obviously, the more populated it is with people of color, I think you'll see less of that. But how can you encourage people to come and disrupt this space?
Just go back 10 seconds.
Where are we here?
Just jump roughly.
White men over the age of 55. This group of people overwhelmingly voted for Trump. Some people have talked about, aggressive truck drivers, cutting them off or not being helpful. So obviously, the more populated it is with people of color, I think you'll see less of that. But how can you encourage people to come and disrupt this space when it seems a bit unwelcoming?
Well, I think just what you're doing, getting myself as a black female out there and letting people know. I drove for almost 8 years, and yes, ran into lots of racism, but however, was out there to do my job. And I think that women are...
So she wants to get some women into it, but it just, they hold this up as an issue here. But what do you think those numbers in terms of the second row and the third row, what do you think they're representative of also?
The proportion of those people in the United States.
In the population, yeah.
Of course.
Anyway.
But these people will be starting to go hungry in the next couple of years, let's say, if things get that bad, and they will be screaming racism.
Yeah.
Still.
Well, everything will be about racism, right? So I just thought it was interesting the way MSNBC reports on this. So soon, it's obviously Trump supporters, racist, white men make up 75% of truck drivers, and that's a problem because they're rude and racist, obviously. And the only way to solve it is to get more black men into truck driving, because then you won't have any of those problems anymore. Black men in trucks don't cut people off. Only white Trump supporters do. It's so infantile and idiotic. But then the people who listen to that are infantile and idiotic, obviously, who lap that up, right? They've got an infantile brain, right? They can't even deconstruct any of it,
She's carrying off. She's picking up where the current U.S. Secretary of Transportation left off last week, when in bigging up the Build Back Better / infrastructure bill, he went off on this bizarre monologue about how, when we do it this time, we're going to do it differently. For example, he said, we'll no longer be around New York building bridges so low that buses carrying, quote, Negro and Puerto Rican children from schools in, upper New York to the beaches will be blocked, will have their access prevented. And people were there like, definitely his woke press corps in the White House, they're on his side, but there was a silence. They didn't know where he was going with that. Yeah, no wonder that even they had a brain fart in that moment, because what he was implying was that the United States was infrastructurally built in such a way as to lock in racism.
Yep. That's the argument.
Like, we're going beyond a systemic racism in terms of attitudes and stuff. No, we're literally living in a physically racist civilization, and we're going to radically transform it the right way.
Right.
So, and
It's an
that's also
interesting theory.
the same guy who, 2 days earlier, Buttigieg and others in the Biden administration have said similarly that the supply chain issues will be solved if everyone gets vaccinated.
Right.
So you see, climate change, structural racism, they just blend and they blend things and they go from one to the next seamlessly. It makes no sense, even ideologically.
Right. But people they just listen to it and they either agree with it or they call it bullshit, and it just carries on. There's no pushback. There's no questioning of it. There doesn't seem to be any representation for critical thinking people in the mainstream media. There hasn't been for quite a long time.
No,
there's no representation of rational human beings in the mainstream media, like as in them representing the population.
Yeah, but like you said, infantile minds on MSNBC, an infantile mind in the White House.
Right.
All of them think alike.
Yeah. And that's ideology, basically.
Yes.
When you're possessed of an ideology, everything gets resolved down to the most simple, inane slogans that resonate in a very visceral, unthinking way with people. And that's what, I don't know, it's possession, and a certain ideological possession. What about talking about wokeness? What's going on in Scotland's bathrooms? I hear you were reporting straight from Scottish bathrooms recently. You were up in
Edinburgh.
In Edinburgh, not where the cop's taking place.
No, this is unrelated to cop, but like we just insinuated with the last item we looked at, it's all related, really. I've given it to Scotty. Headline from Scotland. Scottish government this week, quote, to put tampons and sanitary towels in male toilets in case they are needed by transgender civil servants.
Of which there are many, I suppose.
Oh,
and we look up, we look up the numbers of transgender civil servants in the Scottish government.
Well, these days it might be a growing segment, huh?
But yeah, there's also the one I just sent you, Scotty, that speaks to this. I don't think we need any comment on that one or this next one. High street banks to put pronouns on staff name badges. There's two big UK high street banks, NatWest and HSBC, are the latest lenders to make, the latest ones just, to make the change in a bid to appear more inclusive to transgender workers and customers, again, of which there are many, right?
No. Well, again, it depends on what there aren't really, but then you see polls like, I don't have it to hand, but I saw it this week, something like 35 to 39, over a third of 18 to 22-year-olds polled in the United States today consider themselves to be LGBTQ plus whatever, one of them.
35%?
Yes.
Wow.
So it's having an effect. Now, they're not actually. Most of them are going to grow out of it. The reality is going to shock them back into... Some, of course, genuinely are that confused or whatever, or that way. Let's not weigh in on that. That's a tiny minority. But it's massively inflated by all of this non-stop stuff coming from the top. It is having an effect on people's minds. So then that poll will then be used, it will feed back into policy. And politicians thinking they will actually have to, God, even if they don't personally or aren't ideologically inclined themselves, they go, well, the input here is saying for the next election, there's a third of the population there, of the young population, I want to have on my side, so I will shape policy.
So it's not just transgenders, but it's people who support the whole transgender movement, and that's been the real goal in order to get the non-transgender part of the population, which is 99+% of it, to as much of that percentage as possible to support these measures that are in support of this tiny percentage of transgender people in the population. It just doesn't make any sense. You would never have done that before, you know. I mean, for such a tiny percentage of the population who are actually transgender, who are actually men walking around as women or women walking around as men, you see very, very few, at least, you know, as far as I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong if you live in a big city and they're like every other person, but I don't think that's the case. So when it's a tiny percentage of the population who have this particular inclination, whatever, the idea that institutions would revamp policy for a tiny percent of the population has never ever been done before, because it's reasonable. You can't do that because, I mean, you're pandering to personal inclinations, basically personal whims of each, you know, potentially each member of the population. How do you run a business if you're going to cater to, you know, fairly radical differences between every member of your customer base? Like, you know, that's why you homogenize. That's why you get everybody to like the same thing. That's why you get everybody to agree to do the same thing, to conform, basically, right? Because it's unmanageable otherwise. In any society, you have to conform to social rules and you know, social norms, let's say, in order to fit in and for society to work. If you start giving each individual their personal preferences, and that then those personal preferences have to be validated by authorities or by institutions and reflected by them, well, then the whole thing just collapses. It's not, you can't run society that way at all.
But they're going ahead.
But
like,
they're doing it right
between
because they've lost
the
the plot.
thing about the banks, and then the video we watched a couple of weeks ago, was it the Microsoft employees announcing. Now, they then came back with a rejoinder and
for
said,
blind people.
Yes.
Or for partially sighted people.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's crazy. We can
just one last lockdown story we should mention.
Yeah.
The Netherlands is going to partial lockdown for everyone. That's different. The Austrian one at least makes a sense. It's the logical next step from where everything has happened so far. So what they're targeting, the non-vaccinated. The Netherlands is different. They're going to go into partial lockdown for everyone.
For everyone, vaccinated.
Because COVID-19 infections, presumably by the same standards they were using last year, are way up.
So vaccination hasn't done diddly squat then. We're pretty much back where we were last year. After the promises around vaccines that they're going to restore freedom and restore normalcy, and we could all put it behind us. Apparently not, right? The vaccines haven't worked in that respect. You can say vaccines have not worked in that respect. If any country is going into lockdown with a significant majority of its population vaccinated, vaccines don't work.
Yeah.
End of story.
Yeah. They don't mention that. Of course.
They don't work in order to do what they said they would do, which is prevent there having to be another lockdown and open up society fully, and we can all get back to normal. I'm not saying they don't work in terms of reducing severity of illness and stuff in certain demographics. They maybe do that, but
the lockdown that was recommended by the Dutch version of their independent scientific advisors, their SAGE, was 14 days. So the government took that last week and said 3 weeks, not 2 weeks. Let's do 3 weeks. The Prime Minister said, "Tonight we are bringing a very unpleasant message with very unpleasant and far-reaching measures. The virus is everywhere and needs to be combated everywhere. I want every Dutch citizen to be asking, can I do more? Can I do better? We had hoped with the vaccines we wouldn't have to do this, but we see the same situation all across Europe."
Vaccines don't work.
Between the lines, that's what he's saying.
All right. Cop's over. It was a cop-out. Everybody's very unhappy with it. It was a joke. They didn't achieve anything, especially at the last minute when India and China threw in an amendment that said, "Yeah, we don't want to phase out coal. We want to
phase down." They changed one word, out to down.
Try a bit harder. We'll try a bit harder on the coal thing. I swear, I promise. China's like with its fingers crossed. Yeah, because like 60% of our energy comes from coal, but whatever. And if you all like your plastic crap from China, you better not take our coal away.
Yeah, it's farcical, isn't it? But it got me thinking that even though they deal in abstractions and they want to get a commitment, and that would have some kind of internationally binding effect, however voluntary and unenforceable it is in practice, they still do seek consensus of message. And, they're reasonably happy to have that statement. But then you're thinking, well, if what, 25,000 delegates, 2 weeks, massive event. What was it for? I mean, that surely costs money. What is the tangible benefit from that kind of thing?
It's a talking shop. And I think the main point of it was to promote to the population this is a big thing, and to get people on side and get them compliant with the measures that they're trying to put in place, which is basically destroying the energy economy as it has existed for, the past 150, 200 years. Based on fossil fuels, and turn it over into so-called green energy, which is somehow miraculously and magically going to replace the energy from fossil fuels with wind turbines and solar panels, which obviously it's not. You can't show me one study anywhere that shows that that's a viable replacement for fossil fuels. It's not, given the current population, they probably would, and maybe that's why they don't produce those kind of studies, because they'd say, yes, we can transition to green energy and remove fossil fuels completely in the next 10 years, as long as we reduce the population by about half or more. They're not going to produce a study that has that caveat in there, so you just don't find any. You don't find any explanation of how. Show me the math, show me the figures of how you're going to do it without destroying the global economy, and as a result, killing off a large number of people. Yeah. It's not possible. And even in the case of it, I mean, you look at the whole climate change thing. I know it's been going on for so long. Global warming, humans causing global warming and all that kind of stuff. But they don't talk about it so much. And you see in a list of what climate change is and what it's going to do to the planet. It's all about heating, right? Mm-hmm. Sea level rise, more extreme weather, that kind of stuff. They don't mention something that's in every single prediction or model of, even if it's even human-based climate change or human-caused climate change, is including global warming. One of the real possibilities is, that they even admit to, but it's bizarre, the melting of ice caps. The Greenland ice cap, for example, has been melting and melting. For the past 20 years, it's been reducing every year, which means vast amounts of water flood into the North Atlantic. Of fresh water flooding into the North Atlantic, and the only mention they give to that, which is a valid concern, is that it'll cause sea levels to rise. They don't mention a mainstay of all of this, of all of the models and all of the predictions about human-caused global warming, is that melting of ice caps, sure, it might increase sea level a little bit, but in terms of the North Atlantic, particularly the Greenland ice cap, you have massive amount of fresh water coming into that North Atlantic drift, which basically carries warm water. It's like a conveyor belt that carries warm water across the Atlantic and heats basically Europe and part of North America, keeps it warm in the winters and that kind of stuff. And that massive amount of fresh water flooding into it would basically stall that conveyor belt and break down stop that heating element of for Northern Europe and North America. And then you have freezing. You have a global cooling scenario. And global cooling they even throw that in as a possible global cooling as a result of global warming. But in that scenario, if you're putting that out there as a scenario, why would you be thinking about destroying fossil fuels? Coal and things, wood. You're not allowed to burn anything anymore, basically, right? Mm-hmm. In the scenario where in this climate change scenario or global warming scenario, that envisions a significant cooling of the planet. And, they've talked about Siberian conditions in the UK and Northern Europe. And you're going to destroy fossil fuels and expect people to... And I mean, with that cooling, you get all sorts of other effects that make solar panels pretty much useless. And if, as happened in the UK this past year, the wind doesn't blow enough, your wind turbines aren't much good. So what, everybody freezes to death? So,
yeah,
I'm beyond talking about it. Because, I'm beyond talking about any of it at this point, because anybody who even gives a cursory look at the actual studies and at their arguments and what they say, none of it makes sense.
Yeah, it's arcane. I think it's designed to be that way. Like, can you pull up the item I sent you last from The Guardian, Scotty? You look at this event, 25,000 people. It's like, why do they bother if... Well, one of the mantras, one of the assumptions that dogmas that no one challenges. Everyone was on song and entrained into the same thing, that the purpose was to at least get enough agreement to support our model's predictions of limiting no more than the current 1.5 degree Celsius global warming. So 1.5 C was all, it became a kind of a codex, 1.5 C, 1.5, whatever it takes to maintain. Okay, and then they can all go home and they've achieved enough agreement to satisfy their models forecasting that no more than a 1.5 C warming. Okay, we did something. We're mitigating it. Climate change will still happen, but at least, but there will be no in-depth discussion there with differing opinions,
because they all know already.
Challenging that assumption. Everyone is brought, and they know. Who do you have there? Well, obviously you've got
put it back up.
You've got government heads, you've got private industry.
Yeah.
But 25,000 is a lot of people. Actually, most of them are young activists.
Young activists, yeah.
Maybe they've got internships in the UN or the EU or something like that. They're the next couple of generations. It's about getting them together and gradually exposing them to things like this.
Changes in behaviour needed to tackle climate crisis. And the picture you see there is Sir Patrick Vallance.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sir Patrick Vallance. You may have known me from the TV last year talking about how you need to lock yourself in your house because of COVID. And here I am telling you at the climate conference why you need to lock yourself in your home because of climate change.
The
and
UK
you need to, while you're there, you need to eat less meat and cycle to the grocery store to get your vegetables for 1 hour a day.
That's mostly what they're doing there. They're introducing each other and then training each other into the specific things they need to go back home and promote the shit out of. Cutting meat out of local restaurants, out of cafeterias, whatever it is. Anything that it's meat. It's minor behavioral changes. No one is there to challenge the assumptions that are all wrong.
No dissenters.
But there is an awful lot of discussion that will kind of merge. Like I didn't look at it too closely, but I bet they had panels there like, what did we learn from COVID-19 lockdowns? And then there'll be experts there saying, well, this is what we learned. And if you shape your messaging this way, the people respond this way. They would have had all kinds of cross-party workshops. That's
what it's about. Yeah.
Its function, That's why they would sink all that money into such an event.
That's the bulk of it is activism. Throw up the JPEG COP26 JPEG. This is just from today. This is a commentary at the ending of it. Sir David King, former chief scientific advisor of the UK government and current chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group. So he's right up there in the centre of it. And he said there were real advances made in the agreement, following on from COP21. Adaptation, mitigation and finance were all strengthened. Rules on carbon markets were approved. The importance of the protection, conservation and restoration of nature and ecosystems was recognised, although the phrase critical importance was removed. Apparently for some people it's not of critical importance. And the phase down, not phase out of coal was approved at the last minute. So only going to phase down. We're going to phase it down by, a few shovelfuls of coal. But the next paragraph, but there was no real understanding. This is him complaining about it. But there was no real understanding in the agreement of the extreme nature of the crisis. How do we, the current generation, ensure a manageable future for humanity? The threat to all of us from the loss of polar summer sea ice over the Arctic Ocean is a clear signal of the disaster from rising sea level. Severe extreme weather events and high temperatures. Okay, it doesn't mention cold temperatures, which is very much a mainstream potential result of the loss of sea ice over the Arctic Ocean and the Greenland ice sheet. But it was not addressed in any way. This was the meeting when the end of coal, oil and gas should have been set in place in an orderly, efficient and fair way. The end of coal, oil and gas.
The end, yeah.
What kind of crack is he smoking?
Know. That's like...
Europe is right in the middle, and America and a lot of the world soon are in the middle of an energy crisis where like there were advertisements in German television telling people to cuddle around a tea light this winter because they're not going to have enough gas. because there's a gas price rises and gas shortage, and as a result of COVID and the lockdowns, energy supply, energy crisis. This is going on right now, and it's probably going to get worse over the next few months. And this shithead is saying that today we should have agreed on ending coal, oil, and gas. I mean,
yeah.
Does he want people to die? Does he care that people were freeze to death? How
it's
does
about
he
more
think?
than energy. It's about the very products that make everything run.
I know. The whole world, that's how the world works. You cannot change it over to some wishy-washy bullshit and wind turbine and solar panel things that are dependent on the weather, literally, both of them. And like I said, in many cases, you know, when the wind doesn't blow strong enough, you don't get any electricity from your wind turbines. It's beyond inane. I don't understand how these people, how are they even in positions where they actually get to talk about this stuff when they're so clearly full of shit. They're so idiotic. I don't know.
There have to be esoteric versions of other versions that they're not telling us about this scenario. Sir Patrick Vallance, by the way, was exposed last year for having something like £600,000 worth in shareholding in vaccine companies.
Right, he's probably got a lot of
while
money in green energy,
deciding
green companies
vaccine policy in the United Kingdom.
I bet he's got some money in green companies too. Throw up Brown there just before we finish on this topic. This is from 1972. Check this out. From Brown University to the President of the White House. Dear Mr. President. Written from it's the Department of Geological Sciences from Brown University, 1972, December 3rd. Dear Mr. President, aware of your deep concern with the future of the world, we feel obliged to inform you on the results of the scientific conference held here recently. A previous scientific conference. The conference dealt with the past and future changes of climate and was attended by 42 top American and European investigators. We enclose the summary report published in Science, and further publications are forthcoming. The main conclusion of the meeting was that a global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility, and indeed may be due very soon. The cooling has natural cause and falls within the rank of processes which produced the last ice age. This is a surprising result based largely on recent studies of deep sea sediments. Existing data still do not allow the forecast of the precise timing of the predicted development, nor the assessment of man's interference with the natural trends. It could not be excluded, however, that the cooling now underway in the Northern Hemisphere is the start of the expected shift. The present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century. Yeah, maybe a bit sooner, if continuing at the present pace. Now, that's based on deep sea sediments back then. Deep sea sediments that go back thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands of years, that show a pattern.
Same with ice cores and stuff.
Right. Apparently
I have a theory.
Apparently they changed. Those deep sea sediments.
Now,
someone went back in time and changed them.
People have pulled up over the years from the 70s, Time magazine covers referring to this kind of research that was being done. Global cooling,
ice age
coming. And then, well, the most you can say, but the least rather you can say, is that, well, look at it. There was an hysteria at the time about cooling, and that was being promoted through the media. And then in our time, there's just a different kind of hysteria. It's just global warming.
There was no hysteria over cooling back then, like the hysteria today.
Not like today. It's not comparable. But
it was on one Time magazine cover. Are you kidding me? It's in frickin' every single newspaper, on the lips of every single journalist for the past 10 years.
But all I'm saying is, I'm presenting here, I'm setting it up to knock it down. The skeptic's simple argument, which is, well, look, back then they said cooling, now they say warming. Who knows? Are they right or are they wrong? I have a theory. I think that was real, like
ideologically
non-grant funded. It didn't depend. Their research didn't depend on producing the right data and outcomes.
Yep.
And then around this time in the early 70s, it was hijacked. Club of Rome, limits to growth. especially the British establishment, but not exclusively. Hence, their names keep popping up throughout the last few decades, promoting the heck out of this. Maggie Thatcher in the 80s was the first to give the whole global warming speech as a politician.
Because if it's cooling, if cooling is the prediction, then what do? Well, you invest in fossil fuels, you invest in nuclear power,
massive infrastructure,
and
poverty reduction today, or they're all wiped off the face of the earth.
Right, it's all positive. Cooling produces a positive response from society. Warming allows them to basically put in place plans and ideas for the radical overhaul of society that implies very definitely and very directly the death of large numbers of people. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on to Poland before Pablo leaves.
Yeah.
Tell Pablo what's going on in his country. He's too close to it. How did this all start? Belarus?
It all starts with, so there are several thousand and possibly more in the wings, i.e. back in Minsk, ready to be pushed out there on the frontier. There are several thousand Syrian, Iraqi, mostly.
Why are they suddenly coming through Belarus?
Refugees/migrants in Belarus.
Why are they coming there?
They want to get into Europe, supposedly. Like
how is it,
previous waves did.
It's being facilitated, though.
It obviously is being facilitated. The finger pointing is at Belarus.
At Lukashenko.
The theory being that it's a response to the enormous pressure he came under last year, a type of color revolution situation, followed by or at the same time as massive sanctions from the US and the EU against...
Directed at him and indirectly at Russia, at Putin.
Yes, as an ally of Russia, of course, very tight ally. Belarus would be a major scalp, just like Ukraine was, I suppose, for the West against Russia. So that's the geopolitical interest. The more specific timing interest, though, is the extent to which Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, was against the entire COVID-19 shtick from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. He probably said too many things out loud, and theoretically, the color revolution type blow up when they had elections last August 2020 was a kind of pushback from the system, let's say, against him for being so antagonistic. And not even, at least in Putin's Russia and every other, non-Western countries were at least paying lip service to the agenda to sort of, I presume, to fly under the radar somewhat, although the extent to which Russia has embraced it is a bit scary. But anyway, so Belarus has been flagrantly holding the middle finger up to the entire COVID-19 spiel. So pandemic, they get a color revolution type situation. And then there was another flare up with airlines flying over Belarus that were commandeered. Basically, they sent up flight interceptors to take down a Ryanair aircraft that was on its way to Poland. Because there was a journalist a quote unquote journalist, he was actually a rabid extreme activist against the Lukashenko government because they want to arrest him for involvement.
And then they get sanctioned for that, right?
Something or other, probably in the protest. Then they got sanctioned in response from the EU and Washington.
So this, in theory, is...
So then this flares up. And
it's hard not to see it as a response from Belarus. Using the example of Turkey, or using the example of what Turkey did back a few years ago in trying to put pressure on Europe by funneling refugees. I mean, it's a 2-for-1 in a certain sense. I mean, obviously, those refugees coming from Syria and Iraq are primarily the responsibility of America and the West, who bombed and destroyed Iraq and Syria. So when they come flooding into Turkey, Turkey's like, well, dude, this is your problem. We're not going to house all of these people. Yeah. We're going to facilitate them. But at the same time, we can use them as leverage because, one, too many refugees and, your population aren't going to get too happy and stuff. So we can push them on you, and with the promise of saying that we'll keep them if you play ball with us in certain political agendas. So using that example, Belarus is doing the same thing, but for different reasons, obviously. They're pushing back against, trying to put leverage on Europe.
Turkey has a land border with the countries that were bombed by the West. Yeah, Belarus doesn't.
Right.
So how are they getting into Minsk?
Exactly. Well, they're flying directly from
Iraq. They did apparently ease up visa controls.
Right.
they facilitated.
That's the only way it happens, right?
It must have been directly
at the point of departure in Iraq or in Syria. You can't get on a plane to Belarus unless
Belarus is okay with that.
There's a stamp on your passport that says you've applied for a visa or whatever to gain entry, and you have to do that through official channels. You can't just get in a plane and go to Belarus or anywhere out of any country unless you have proper entry requirements that are given by the country that you're going to.
Yeah.
So clearly Belarus facilitated the movement of these migrants, and obviously then it's been pushed onto
They're then
Poland.
encouraging them out to Poland. There are different testimonies from people who are among the refugees themselves or among border guards, Polish border guards, who claim to have seen specific documentation with instructions given to these refugees from some people in Minsk, directing them where to go, how to try and attempt to breach the border. Poland is obviously like raging because they managed to escape, so to speak, the mass migration wave of 2015, and now this. Okay, so there are different levels to this. First thing, you're going to have empathy for people who are being used again for geopolitical purposes. They're being used. Several of them, I've heard of between 8 and 12 people have died. It's freezing cold, obviously, in deep continental Eastern Europe right now. They are literally in like no man's land because they have Belarusian guards armed at their backs, and then they have an increasingly enormous, several thousand troops the Poles sent, and they're putting out calls. They want NATO, they want American troops. The British sent a small contingent of forces, 10 to help with infrastructure. Yeah, probably to help with directing whatever the hell's going on. I'm not sure if it's all on Belarus though. Putin, Putin's been targeted on this because, the theory being Belarus doesn't do anything without the Kremlin's approval. But the Kremlin's been defending itself all week, saying, well, hang on, we didn't start this thing by referring to the wars in the Middle East. Putin further suggested that, hang on, whatever's going on here at the Minsk end, none of this would be possible without some kind of facilitation at the EU end, within Poland and beyond inside Europe. So he's suggesting that there's some gamesmanship on both sides going on here.
And Lukashenko threatened to cut off gas supplies to Europe, to Germany. There's a Russian gas pipeline coming from Russia through Belarus into Germany, about a third of Germany's gas, I think, at least. And he threatened to shut that off, or saying that he could do that, but apparently Putin, or the Russians, said, no, that's not going to happen, because obviously they have control over it. It's coming directly from there, and they do have control over Belarus in the sense that the pipeline running through Belarus is
originates in Russia.
Is Russia. So they've pushed back on that. So, and it obviously works in their favor, right? They don't look like they're... The Russians, to be fair, have said repeatedly that they will never interrupt the gas supplies they will never use gas in that respect as a geopolitical weapon against Europe, and they haven't done so. There's no reason to think that they have done so, or they intend to do so, So, yeah. So that's where it's at, and it's just, is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Are there going to be more migrants? Is it all just going to peter out, or is this going to be a rolling thing over the next few months right through the winter?
It might not even last that long. This might come to a head soon because it's going to be freezing. Something has to give. Either Belarus takes them back to Minsk and houses and feeds them, or Poland has to yield and open. But Poland is like tackling this full. This is part of the irony of the whole thing. They're doing a full Orban on this. Yeah, reinforcing the walls, not letting anyone in. They're heavily armed. Actually, a Polish soldier accidentally killed himself. Supposedly his gun discharged accidentally. So there's already been one Polish military death accidentally, they say today. The Polish government is basically... There's so many layers to this. The Polish government is itself under extreme pressure from the European Union over its alleged political misuse of the judicial system once the current party, which is basically a populist right party, took power. And to the extent that, they've been threatened with being booted out of the European Union, having themselves serious sanctions from Brussels, that's separate from the Belarus issue. So that's going on between Poland and Europe. In this issue, Poland is looking to its allies in the European Union and further afield to come rescue them or to support them at least.
They want to activate NATO's Article 4, right? Of
one of us is under threat,
mutual defense, basically. Yeah, mutual. Which is just, there's so much hyperbole around these situations, and we've dealt with this many times before, but I mean, over the past number of years, all of the stuff in the media about, there's going to be a nuclear war between Russia and the US, all that kind of stuff, and repeatedly we were like, poo-pooing it and saying it's not going to happen, and obviously it didn't happen. So,
well, and it's being fueled, especially, it's noticeable in the British media.
Yeah.
The British Foreign Secretary, actually, before I'll give a statement from her in a minute. The thing I just sent you, Scotty, is a tweet with a British tabloid's headline, I think yesterday. The US to put 4,000 mile per hour Dark Eagle nukes in Germany to, quote, blitz Moscow in 6 minutes.
Yeah.
That was their actual headline in the most read paper in the United Kingdom.
Dark Eagle nukes.
They later had to update the article because, in fact, these are theoretical. They're not built yet. These are the theoretical US hypersonic missiles.
That's an example of the sensationalism in media. What were you going to say, Scotty?
No, I was just going to say, note that these don't exist yet, and they're expected to come into service in 2023. But the tests that they've done already,
they don't work.
They're crap. They don't work.
So that people, you need to always take stuff in the media with a grain of salt and do your own research and apply some rational, clear-headed thinking about the whole thing and understand how things actually work as opposed to how the media would want you to believe they work. People are being sold bullshit and have been for decades by the media and given a distorted view of reality. And just stop reacting like Pavlovian dogs to media headlines. You know what I mean? No matter where they come from, because there's always a more complex, nuanced explanation behind it that is not as sensational.
There's a comment here in the chat room to that headline. Feels very 80s to me.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's Cold War rhetoric, squared. But it doesn't even have any substantial threat behind it because, as Scotty pointed out, the headline wants to invite its readers to believe that we're on the precipice, possibly, of a nuclear standoff between Washington and Russia.
Yeah, fear.
But actually, there would only be there isn't even a standoff because those weapons don't exist.
Right. Joke.
But in the meantime, the rhetoric from the British is off the charts. In the let me see, the Telegraph yesterday, the British Foreign Secretary went on his spiel. I've sent it to you just there, Scotty. Basically, it's like just pure Liz Truss. She's the current Foreign Secretary for the British government. We must stand together for freedom and democracy. Without really referring to any facts, she takes it as a given that her readership understands that this is a Russian-caused hybrid war type situation against the West. And she's rallying the troops, the troops being like NATO. Not the EU, of course, because Britain's no longer in the EU, but we're all one and together as NATO against the Russian threat.
Right.
The quintessential irony at the heart of all this, though, is that if it is indeed what it appears to be, a kind of a fourth generation type warfare, a hybrid warfare tactic by Belarus to get what it wants geopolitically, or to get some balance, to fight back. It's just one weapon it has to fight back. Where did it learn the use of what is called directed mass migration from?
Yeah.
It's not just, we mentioned Erdogan earlier. He wasn't, he could have used that at any time over the last 2 decades. By the time he used it, there have been some 4 to 6 million Syrians and Iraqis and Afghanis living in house and foods and clothes in Turkey for over a decade. You know what I mean? So where did this, the idea Erdogan didn't come up with it either.
No.
And Lukashenko's, didn't hatch this plot with the Kremlin. They're applying a tactic that somebody else first started using.
Yeah, that's par for the course, right?
And then they get to turn around and lecture them about freedom and democracy. All the while, smelling of roses. Like, we have never conceived, much less done something like this. Similar statement today, in fact, from the head of the British military forces, General Sir Nick Carter. It's BS. We've already explained why it's BS, but still, this is what they feed Western audience on a daily basis. British general warns about possible accidental war with Russia. As if A, you're on military parity with Russia, you're not. And B, it's not even close to an accident. There'll be nothing accidental about it. This is just pure posturing. Scroll down a bit, I want to see what he says. Yeah, we're at risk of accidental war, the chief of the defense staff said, adding that, quote, traditional diplomatic mechanisms are no longer there. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that they've been like booting Russian diplomats out of their countries in multiple stages over the last 10 some years, especially since Ukraine. The emergence of a, quote, multipolar world from the ashes of the bipolar international system of the Cold War has led to greater competition between nations, which you can easily see the UK as well as other Western states and Russia pitted against one another. Well, that's okay. That's obvious. But you can see what he has in mind here. It's like the very fact that the reason he's been able to launch on this spiel about Russia returning to Russian, Russophobia, is thanks to this border dispute.
Well, they take every opportunity, right?
Anything. And they wouldn't even have to mention it. I'll just refer back to the last 10 years of what we've been saying about Russia.
You already know all this, right? Yeah. So yeah, our prediction on the Poland border crisis is that it's gonna blow over fairly soon. Something will have to be done.
Or not. This is Poland we're talking about.
Yeah.
1939. Poland hasn't always had the smartest leaders. I'm not sure that's no longer the case.
Yeah.
They could do something nuts. Whereas, say, Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, did some similar measures or made similar statements in reinforcing Hungary, and they, managed to shield any kind of large numbers of migrants from passing, even just from passing through, never mind staying there. I wouldn't put it past the Poles to start shooting.
I doubt it.
Really? You doubt it?
No, they wouldn't do that, no.
No?
No. That would look very bad. They're not that crazy yet.
Well, in 1939, there was shooting. And then there was a back and forth about who instigated it and who was disguised as... I think they could be tricked into something.
Yeah, well, there could be some provocation or whatever, but,
yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But, Pablo, don't get too freaked out about it. It'll work itself out.
Oh, yeah, we've got a guy here who's freaking out. I didn't say the most helpful thing there. Sorry, dude.
No. You said earlier on that it was going to blow over fairly quickly. Do you want to stick with that one?
Yeah.
All right. Neil's sticking with that one.
Assume the redactor is Polish, really. No. Yeah.
Tangled history, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just afraid that the Polish leadership will misread signals from Britain and elsewhere in the West, presumably the US, as a green light to go too far.
We've got your back kind of thing. And
which provokes Belarus. And then Russia's like, it is a classic geopolitical standoff. The kind of thing that did start wars.
In the past, started wars, yeah. Yep. All right. Anything else you want to bring up of note?
There could be something blowing up in Wisconsin.
Tomorrow. The Rittenhouse trial. I don't know who's been following the Rittenhouse trial. But that could be this. Yeah, it could be the next round of looting and burning on streets. Who knows where? Possibly in Wisconsin, but possibly further afield. Rittenhouse last summer in Kenosha in Wisconsin. During the riots over, I can't remember that guy's name, but a black guy who was shot by cops, rioting for several days. Rittenhouse goes down with his gun and his medical bag to put out fires and to protect businesses, and ends up shooting 2 people who tried to attack him and injuring one other guy. And he's on trial. He's been on trial for a couple of weeks now, and it's been interesting enough to watch the trial. Actually, it's been long, but tomorrow the jury is going to deliberate and give their verdict, and it's expected that he'll be pretty much let off with and only face a couple of minor charges or something of illegal possession of a weapon or transporting across state lines, and in that case there's a chance that
which will surprise the people who live in the pseudo reality, because they were told by the media last year that this man is a guilty Trump supporting white supremacist, part of a militia. Joe Biden, then a candidate, went on CNN and said that Kyle Rittenhouse, he was hearing from people, was a member of the Illinois white supremacist militia. And why the hell hasn't our president, condemned this man yet? Joe Biden, who in the same interview said the only reason I joined the race to become president was because I was motivated by what I saw in Charlottesville. So the guy is already condemned. A lot of people are going to wake up on Monday and go, what the hell's going on? And hence the energy that probably will be released into rioting. The Wisconsin governor isn't taking any chances. 500 National Guard troops on standby.
For tomorrow night, probably, the 2 guys he shot, or three people he shot, 2 of them he killed, 1 of them he just injured, are all white guys who were for some reason in the middle of basically a Black Lives Matter burning and looting session in response to the shooting of a black guy by a cop a few days previously. And but the 2 guys he shot, one of them has a criminal record for domestic abuse, and the other one he shot, both of them dead. The one of them he shot has a criminal record as a child abuse, basically pedophile. He's a registered child sex offender. And he was shot a few times, once in the cojones. There's some kind of cosmic justice there, maybe. But so that's the bare bones of that case. It's just an ongoing
culture
war in America that doesn't seem to have any solution. It's just has to work itself out, for better or worse. And just stay safe, stay away from it. Stay away from most things, basically. But don't worry too much about the COVID, unless you're listening to this and you're over 80 with 3 or 4 long-term comorbidities. The COVID won't really do you any harm.
Yeah.
Will that do?
That'll do.
We'll call it quits there for this week. That was all the news that was fit, or that we thought was fit to actually talk about. We hope you enjoyed our little discussion here. Thanks for commenting and talking and chatting and watching and listening and whatever you were doing. And Pablo, just take it easy. Don't worry too much. I know Polish people have a tendency to get a bit worked up about things in general. So you all need to take a chill pill and not stress it too much. Yeah, so we'll be back next week with another show on whatever's been happening between now and then. We hope you'll join us for it. Stay tuned and stay safe, and see you next week. Bye.
Till next time. Bye, everyone.
Can't stop the signal now.